On the afternoon of December 11, 1941, Adolf Hitler stood before the Reichstag in Berlin and announced, in a speech lasting roughly 90 minutes, that Germany considered itself in a state of war with the United States of America. The declaration came 4 days after Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, and it arrived without any treaty obligation requiring it, without any American attack on German forces or territory that might have justified it as a defensive response, and without any serious consultation of Germany's own military and naval leadership about whether the Reich possessed the strategic capacity to fight a two-ocean war against an industrial power whose factories had not yet been touched by a single enemy bomb. Hitler simply chose to do it, in a speech that spent considerably more time attacking Franklin Roosevelt personally, mocking American culture as decadent and racially mixed, and indulging in a lengthy anti-Semitic tirade blaming Jewish influence for supposedly manipulating American foreign policy, than it did offering any coherent strategic justification for why Germany's interests were served by voluntarily adding the world's largest industrial economy to the list of nations actively at war with the Reich. This decision, made in the span of a single Reichstag address, would go on to be identified by a broad consensus of military historians, examining the war's overall trajectory as quite possibly the single most consequential unforced strategic error Hitler made during the entire conflict. A judgment that becomes only more striking when you consider how many genuinely difficult and defensible decisions Hitler had to weigh throughout the war's other major turning points. The invasion of the Soviet Union, whatever its ultimate catastrophic outcome, at least reflected a calculated strategic gamble about defeating an ideological enemy before it could fully mobilize its own considerable resources. The declaration of war against the United States reflected no comparable strategic calculation at all. Germany's formal treaty obligation to Japan under the Tripartite Pact, signed in September 1940, required German support only if Japan itself were attacked by a third power, a defensive clause that did not apply to Japan's own unprovoked attack on Pearl Harbor, and therefore created no binding obligation whatsoever for Germany to declare war on the United States in response. This is the story of the single order, delivered not through any military chain of command, but through Hitler's own voice before an assembled Reichstag, that transformed a war Germany might conceivably have won, or at minimum fought to a negotiated conclusion, into a war against a coalition possessing an industrial and manpower advantage so overwhelming that Germany's eventual defeat, while never inevitable in any single battle, became, from the moment of that declaration forward, an outcome that grew steadily more difficult to avoid with every passing month of American war production reaching the battlefield. It is a story about contempt, about a fundamental and catastrophic misjudgment of American character and capability, and about how the single most powerful man in Germany chose, entirely of his own volition, to hand his enemies the one resource they had previously lacked, and that his own advisers understood, with considerably more clarity than Hitler himself displayed, Germany could not afford to face. To understand why Hitler felt free to make this declaration, and why he did not view it as the reckless gamble that hindsight suggests it plainly was, you have to understand the specific, already deteriorating relationship between Germany and the United States that had developed over the preceding 2 years, a relationship that fell well short of formal war, but that had, by late 1941, already involved a considerable amount of direct military confrontation in the Atlantic Ocean. The United States, while officially neutral until Pearl Harbor, had spent 1940 and 1941 providing increasingly substantial material support to Britain, beginning with the Destroyers for Bases Agreement in September 1940 and expanding dramatically with the Lend-Lease Act of March 1941, which authorized the President to supply war material to Britain and, eventually, the Soviet Union, without requiring immediate payment, a policy that Roosevelt had explicitly justified to the American public, using the analogy of lending a garden hose to a neighbor whose house was on fire. This material support increasingly extended into direct naval involvement well before any formal declaration of war existed between Germany and the United States. American naval vessels began escorting convoys carrying Lend-Lease supplies partway across the Atlantic in the summer of 1941, placing American warships in direct proximity to German U-boats operating in the same waters. And several incidents during this period brought the two nations to the brink of open naval conflict without either side formally declaring war. The USS Greer, an American destroyer, exchanged fire with a German submarine in September 1941 after tracking and reporting the U-boat's position to British forces, an engagement that Roosevelt subsequently used to justify a shoot on sight order authorizing American naval vessels to fire on German or Italian warships encountered in what the United States designated its own defensive waters. The USS Carney was torpedoed and damaged by a German U-boat in October 1941, killing 11 American sailors. And the USS Reuben James was sunk entirely by a German torpedo later that same month, killing over 100 American crew members. The first American warship lost to enemy action in the conflict months before Pearl Harbor and the formal state of war that followed it. From Hitler's perspective, and from the perspective of German Naval Command more broadly, this pattern of escalating American involvement in the Atlantic without any accompanying formal declaration of war represented a frustrating and, in some respects, genuinely unfair strategic situation. American warships were actively engaging German submarines. American resources were flowing to Britain in ever-increasing volume, and American public rhetoric increasingly framed Germany as the primary threat to democratic civilization, all while the United States retained the diplomatic and legal benefits of formal neutrality that prevented Germany from treating American shipping and naval vessels as fully legitimate wartime targets, without risking exactly the kind of formal war declaration Hitler would eventually choose to initiate voluntarily. This context matters enormously to understanding Hitler's state of mind heading into December 1941, since it meant the declaration of war he delivered following Pearl Harbor was not, from his own perspective, an abrupt and unprecedented escalation, but rather the formal acknowledgement of a conflict he believed had already been effectively underway for months, initiated, in his own reading of events, by American aggression rather than German provocation. Beyond the immediate context of the undeclared Atlantic naval conflict, Hitler's decision to declare war on the United States reflected a deeper and more consequential misjudgment rooted in his own ideological worldview, one that led him to systematically underestimate American industrial and military potential in ways that his own military and economic advisors, when they dared to offer contrary assessments, found extraordinarily difficult to correct. Hitler's racial ideology held that the United States represented a fundamentally weakened, racially mixed society, its population diluted by immigration, and its culture corrupted by what Nazi propaganda consistently characterized as excessive Jewish influence over finance, media, and government. A society Hitler believed lacked the racial and cultural cohesion necessary to mobilize effectively for a sustained, demanding war effort regardless of its raw industrial capacity on paper. This ideological contempt led Hitler to dismiss or significantly discount intelligence and economic analysis that more accurately described American industrial potential, information that was, in fact, available to German planners well before December 1941 through open economic data, diplomatic reporting, and German industrialists' own pre-war business dealings with American companies. Hitler had visited neither the United States nor, for that matter, spent any significant time studying American industrial capacity firsthand, and his understanding of American society appears to have been shaped considerably more by his own ideological priors than by any rigorous strategic assessment of what a fully mobilized American war economy might actually be capable of producing once formally committed to a two-front global conflict. Several German officials who had spent time in the United States, including diplomatic staff at the German embassy in Washington before its closure, had submitted reports describing American industrial capacity in terms that should have given German strategic planning considerable pause. Reports that appear to have received limited weight relative to Hitler's own confident, ideologically grounded assumptions about American weakness. This pattern of dismissing expert assessment in favor of ideologically comfortable assumptions about enemy weakness would recur throughout Hitler's wartime decision-making in ways this channel has explored in other contexts. From his underestimation of Soviet mobilization capacity during the planning of Operation Barbarossa to his repeated dismissal of his own general's tactical warnings, once battlefield reality began contradicting his preferred narrative. The declaration of war against the United States represents, in this sense, not an isolated error, but a particularly consequential instance of a broader and recurring failure mode. A supreme commander whose ideological convictions about racial and national character consistently overrode more accurate intelligence assessments available to him, producing strategic decisions that reflected what Hitler wanted to believe about his enemy's capabilities rather than what the actual available evidence indicated those capabilities genuinely were. The content and tone of Hitler's actual December 11 speech offers a revealing window into how thoroughly emotional grievance and ideological conviction, rather than sober strategic calculation, appear to have driven the decision. Rather than presenting the declaration as a carefully considered response to genuine American provocation, framed in terms that might have rallied German public opinion around a clear and legitimate strategic rationale, Hitler's address spent a considerable portion of its 90-minute length on an extended, deeply personal attack against Franklin Roosevelt specifically, characterizing the American president in terms that reflected genuine personal animus rather than measured diplomatic or strategic language, accusing Roosevelt of being manipulated by, in Hitler's own anti-Semitic framing, Jewish financial interests supposedly determined to drag the United States into a war against Germany regardless of America's actual national interests. This framing reveals something important about the psychological dimension of Hitler's decision that pure strategic analysis alone cannot fully capture. Hitler appears to have experienced Roosevelt's escalating support for Britain, including the increasingly direct naval confrontations this account has already described, as a deeply personal affront and provocation, one that had been building in Hitler's own private rhetoric and internal correspondence for months before Pearl Harbor provided the specific triggering event that allowed him to formalize a declaration he may have already been emotionally prepared to make regardless of Japan's own actions. Contemporary accounts from within Hitler's inner circle describe him expressing satisfaction and even a degree of relief upon learning of the Pearl Harbor attack, viewing it not primarily through the lens of how it might complicate Germany's own strategic position, but as a welcome development that finally provided the pretext and public justification needed to formally declare the war against the United States he appears to have already privately concluded was both inevitable and, in his own assessment, winnable. German naval commanders, particularly Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, had in fact been pressing Hitler for months before Pearl Harbor to authorize more aggressive action against American shipping, frustrated by the restrictions Hitler had imposed on U-boat commanders, specifically intended to avoid provoking exactly the kind of formal American entry into the war that the escalating Atlantic naval incidents already risked triggering regardless of German restraint. This detail complicates any simple narrative in which Hitler's declaration reflected pure recklessness, with no counterbalancing strategic consideration at all. Hitler had, in fact, spent much of 1941 deliberately trying to avoid a formal war with the United States, imposing restraint on his own naval forces, specifically to prevent exactly the outcome he then chose to embrace voluntarily within days of Pearl Harbor, a reversal that reflects less a consistent strategic philosophy than an emotional and ideological reaction to a specific triggering event that Hitler processed through the lens of vindication and opportunity rather than sober risk assessment. The specific political problem Hitler's declaration solved for Franklin Roosevelt deserves close attention, because it represents perhaps the single most concrete and immediate way in which Hitler's decision directly and voluntarily strengthened his enemy's strategic position at a moment when Roosevelt himself had no reliable path to achieving the same outcome through his own initiative. In the days immediately following Pearl Harbor, American public and congressional anger focused overwhelmingly on Japan, the nation that had actually attacked American territory and killed American servicemen, and Roosevelt's own declaration of war, delivered to Congress on December 8th, addressed Japan specifically, making no formal request for a declaration of war against Germany despite Roosevelt's own well-documented private conviction, shared with Churchill and other advisors, that Nazi Germany represented the more serious long-term strategic threat to American and global security. This distinction mattered enormously given the political realities Roosevelt faced. American isolationist sentiment, while dramatically weakened by the shock of Pearl Harbor, had remained a genuinely powerful force in American domestic politics throughout 1941, and Roosevelt's own prior efforts to build public and congressional support for more direct American involvement in the European conflict had proceeded cautiously and incrementally, reflecting his accurate assessment that American public opinion, even as it grew increasingly sympathetic to Britain's plight, remained considerably more hesitant about the prospect of American soldiers fighting and dying in another European war than it was about responding to a direct Japanese attack on American soil and American servicemen. Had Germany not declared war on the United States, Roosevelt would have faced a genuinely difficult and politically uncertain task in building the same level of congressional and public support for an American declaration of war against Germany specifically, a nation that, whatever its material support for Japan and its escalating Atlantic naval confrontations with American vessels, had not carried out anything resembling the direct, dramatic attack on American territory that made the case against Japan so immediately and viscerally compelling to the American public. Hitler's voluntary declaration eliminated this political problem entirely and immediately, allowing Roosevelt to request and receive a formal declaration of war against Germany from Congress on the same day, December 11th, without needing to expend any of the political capital or navigate any of the domestic political resistance that building the case for war against Germany specifically might otherwise have required. This outcome allowed Roosevelt to pursue the Germany First strategic priority that American and British military planners had already agreed represented the more sound overall Allied strategy, directing the preponderance of American military and industrial resources toward the European theater despite Japan being the nation that had actually attacked the United States. A strategic alignment between American war policy and the interests of Britain and eventually the Soviet Union that Hitler's own declaration had made dramatically easier for Roosevelt to implement without the sustained domestic political battle that pursuing the same priority might otherwise have demanded. Several historians examining the specific dimension of the decision have noted the genuine irony involved. Hitler, through a single voluntary declaration requiring no American action to provoke it, solved what may have been Roosevelt's single most difficult remaining domestic political obstacle to fighting the war Roosevelt himself had already privately concluded was strategically necessary. The practical, material consequences of this formal state of war becoming fully directed against Germany specifically, rather than remaining confined to indirect support for Britain through Lend-Lease and limited Atlantic naval engagement, unfolded over the following years at a scale that validated every warning German naval and economic planners had raised about the danger of provoking full American industrial mobilization. American war production, which had already been expanding significantly through 1941 in support of Lend-Lease commitments, accelerated dramatically once the United States became a direct combatant with the full legal and political authority to redirect its entire economy toward military production without the political constraints that formal neutrality, however loosely interpreted in practice, had previously imposed. By 1944, American industrial output had reached a scale that dwarfed the combined production capacity of every other combatant nation in the war, Axis and Allied alike, producing military aircraft, naval vessels, tanks, and war material of every category at rates that German economic planners, even those who had accurately warned against provoking full American entry into the war, had generally underestimated in their pre-war assessments. American shipyards alone launched Liberty ships, the standardized cargo vessels that formed the backbone of Allied transatlantic logistics, at a pace that eventually outstripped German U-boats' capacity to sink them faster than replacements could be built, a production achievement that directly undermined the entire strategic logic behind Germany's submarine campaign in the Atlantic, since that campaign's success depended fundamentally on sinking Allied shipping faster than American shipyards could replace it, a race German naval planners increasingly recognized. As American production accelerated through 1942 and 1943, that Germany could not realistically win once the full weight of American industrial capacity had been formally and legally directed toward the war effort. This industrial mobilization extended well beyond shipping into every category of war material that would eventually prove decisive in the European theater specifically, including the aircraft that would conduct the strategic bombing campaign against German industry and infrastructure, the landing craft and amphibious equipment that made the Normandy invasion logistically possible, and the enormous quantities of fuel, ammunition, and supplies that sustained American, British, and eventually liberated French forces throughout the campaign across Western Europe following D-Day. None of this specific war-winning industrial output would have been legally or politically available for direct deployment against Germany, at the scale and with the urgency it eventually achieved, without the formal state of war Hitler's own voluntary declaration had established, a reality that makes the December 11th decision genuinely difficult to characterize as anything other than a direct, self-inflicted acceleration of exactly the kind of overwhelming material disadvantage that German strategic planners had spent years trying to avoid triggering through careful management of the undeclared Atlantic conflict this account has already described. In the immediate weeks following the declaration of war, German Naval Command did achieve a genuine, if ultimately misleading, tactical success that illustrates how the true strategic cost of Hitler's decision was not immediately apparent to German planners in the war's early months. Admiral Karl Donitz, commanding Germany's U-boat fleet, recognized that American coastal shipping along the eastern seaboard remained almost entirely unprepared for submarine warfare, since American merchant vessels had operated for years without the wartime precautions, convoy escorts, and coastal blackout procedures that British shipping had adopted out of necessity years earlier. Donitz launched Operation Drumbeat, sending a small number of long-range U-boats to operate directly off the American coast beginning in January 1942, and these submarines found American shipping remarkably vulnerable, sinking merchant vessels silhouetted against the illuminated skylines of American coastal cities that had not yet adopted blackout discipline, achieving a period of dramatic tactical success that German propaganda celebrated extensively as vindication of Hitler's decision to formally engage the United States. This early tactical success, however genuine in the specific, limited sense of ships sunk and cargo destroyed in the first months of 1942, obscured the much larger and ultimately decisive strategic reality that was simultaneously unfolding. American shipyards were already beginning the massive wartime production surge that would, within roughly a year, produce replacement tonnage at a rate that made Operation Drumbeat's early successes strategically insignificant relative to the sheer scale of American industrial capacity now being directed with full legal and political authority against exactly the kind of submarine campaign that represented Germany's best remaining hope for defeating Britain through blockade before American ground forces could be fully mobilized and deployed to the European theater. The American coastal shipping vulnerabilities that Donit's U-boats exploited so effectively in early 1942 were corrected within months through convoy systems, coastal blackout enforcement, and expanded naval escort capacity. Improvements that reflected exactly the kind of rapid, well-resourced military adaptation that a fully mobilized American war economy, now formally committed to the Atlantic conflict without the political constraints of prior neutrality, could implement at a pace German naval planners had not adequately anticipated when weighing the costs and benefits of provoking full American entry into the war. This pattern, genuine short-term tactical gains, obscuring a catastrophic long-term strategic deterioration, characterizes much of how German military and political leadership processed the consequences of Hitler's declaration throughout 1942, a year in which German forces continued to achieve significant battlefield successes across multiple theaters, even as the underlying industrial and manpower balance of the war was shifting steadily and irreversibly in a direction that Hitler's own voluntary decision the previous December had done more than perhaps any other single choice to accelerate. Internal reaction within Germany's own diplomatic and military establishment to Hitler's decision reveals that at least some senior officials recognized, even in the immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor, the serious strategic risk the declaration represented, though this recognition proved entirely insufficient to alter or even meaningfully delay Hitler's chosen course of action. Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop, who bore direct responsibility for managing Germany's diplomatic relationship with the United States, and who understood better than most senior Nazi officials the legal and diplomatic technicalities involved, reportedly expressed genuine reluctance about the declaration in private conversations with colleagues, recognizing that Germany's actual treaty obligations to Japan did not require this response, and that voluntarily expanding the war to include the United States carried risks that Ribbentrop's own diplomatic assessment suggested outweighed whatever symbolic or propaganda benefits Hitler believed the declaration would provide. This reluctance, however genuine, did not translate into any sustained or effective resistance to Hitler's decision, reflecting the same pattern this channel has documented in other contexts throughout Hitler's wartime decision-making. Senior officials who harbored private doubts about a specific course of action generally found themselves unable or unwilling to press those doubts forcefully enough to alter Hitler's chosen path, particularly on a decision Hitler had framed in terms of national honor and symbolic solidarity with Japan rather than as a straightforward military strategic calculation open to the kind of technical objection Ribbentrop's diplomatic expertise might otherwise have carried more weight in shaping. Ribbentrop ultimately carried out his assigned role in the process, formally delivering Germany's declaration of war to the American Charge d'Affaires in Berlin on December 11th, executing a decision he had privately questioned, but which he, like so many other senior officials surrounding Hitler by this point in the war, lacked the institutional standing or personal willingness to seriously contest once Hitler had made his intentions clear. German military leadership more broadly appears to have received the declaration with a similarly muted response, reflecting less enthusiastic agreement with Hitler's strategic reasoning than a general institutional pattern, already well established by December 1941, in which senior officers had learned that voicing serious strategic objections to Hitler's personal decisions carried professional risks that made silence, or at most carefully hedged private reservations shared only among trusted colleagues, the considerably safer course of action. This institutional silence, extending across a decision that several post-war military analyses have identified as among the war's most consequential strategic errors, illustrates just how thoroughly the culture of deference and diminishing institutional pushback this channel has traced through Hitler's relationship with his generals throughout the war had already taken hold by the war's second year, extending even to a decision of this scale and consequence, made not through any military planning process at all, but through Hitler's own individual judgment, announced to the German military and diplomatic establishment largely as a fait accompli rather than a strategic question genuinely open for expert consultation and debate. It is worth considering, with appropriate historical caution about the inherent uncertainty of counterfactual analysis, what the war's trajectory might plausibly have looked like had Hitler declined to declare war on the United States in December 1941, since this specific counterfactual scenario has attracted considerable attention from historians precisely because, unlike many alternative history questions about the war, this particular decision point involved a genuinely available and technically straightforward alternative course of action that Hitler could have pursued without violating any actual treaty obligation. Had Hitler simply declined to declare war, allowing the Tripartite Pact's defensive-only obligations to remain technically unfulfilled, given that Japan had been the aggressor rather than the attacked party, the United States would have entered a formal state of war against Japan alone, leaving Roosevelt to navigate the considerably more difficult political challenge of separately building congressional and public support for war against Germany, specifically. Some historians examining this scenario have suggested Roosevelt would likely have eventually succeeded in bringing the United States into the European conflict regardless, given his own well-documented private conviction that Germany represented the more serious long-term threat and his demonstrated skill throughout 1941 in gradually building public and congressional support for increasingly direct American involvement in supporting Britain. Under this reading, Hitler's declaration accelerated an American entry into the European war that would likely have occurred eventually in any case, making the practical consequence of his decision more a matter of timing than of fundamentally altering the war's ultimate outcome. Other historians have offered a more consequential counterfactual assessment, noting that the specific timing of American entry into the European theater mattered enormously to how the war's middle years unfolded, and that even a delay of 6 months to a year in formal American commitment to the Germany First strategic priority, while American isolationist sentiment and congressional resistance to a second, non-Japan-focused war effort worked through whatever political process would have been required absent Hitler's voluntary declaration, could have provided Germany with meaningfully more time to consolidate its position on the Eastern Front, potentially alter the outcome of the Stalingrad campaign, or otherwise capitalize on a delayed rather than immediate American industrial mobilization specifically directed against German targets. This scenario suggests that even if American entry into the European war remained likely in the long run, the specific acceleration Hitler's declaration provided, delivering full legal and political authorization for American resources to flow toward the European theater from the earliest possible moment, rather than after a potentially prolonged domestic political debate, represented a genuinely consequential strategic gift to the Allied war effort that a more cautious German approach might have delayed, even if it could not have prevented American involvement entirely. The raw economic and industrial statistics underlying this strategic shift help illustrate just how significant a resource Hitler's declaration formally activated against Germany. Figures that German economic planners, whatever their private reservations about the decision, would have understood in general terms even if the full scale of eventual American mobilization exceeded most contemporary projections. The United States entered the war possessing an industrial economy considerably larger than Germany's own, a gap that had already existed throughout the 1930s, but that had not previously been directed toward war production at anything approaching full capacity, since American industry through the late 1930s and into 1941 continued producing substantially for civilian consumer markets, even as Lend-Lease commitments gradually increased the proportion of manufacturing capacity devoted to military material. Formal American entry into the war eliminated any remaining political or legal constraint on converting the full breadth of this industrial capacity toward military production, a conversion that proceeded with remarkable speed once the political and legal authorization Hitler's declaration provided removed the last meaningful obstacle to total economic mobilization. By the war's final years, American war production alone, considered separately from the substantial industrial contributions of Britain and the Soviet Union, exceeded German war production by a margin that made the cumulative material advantage enjoyed by the combined Allied coalition increasingly difficult for German industry, however skillfully managed by economic planners like Albert Speer, to meaningfully offset through efficiency improvements or the kind of advanced weapons technology that German engineering continued producing throughout the war's later years. American aircraft production alone reached a scale by 1944 that allowed the United States to simultaneously sustain a massive strategic bombing campaign against German industrial infrastructure, supply thousands of aircraft to the Pacific Theater against Japan, and still maintain substantial reserves for training and attrition replacement, a triple capacity that no other combatant nation in the entire war, on either side of the conflict, came close to matching. American tank and vehicle production similarly reached volumes that allowed the United States to equip not only its own rapidly expanding army, but to supply substantial quantities of vehicles to British and Soviet forces through continued Lend-Lease shipments, now flowing with the full formal backing of a nation legally and politically committed to Germany's defeat rather than the more constrained, incrementally justified support arrangement that had characterized American assistance before. December 1941. This is not to suggest German technological innovation proved strategically insignificant, since advanced German weapon systems did impose real costs and complications on Allied forces throughout the war's final years, but rather to emphasize that these technological advantages operated against a backdrop of raw material and production capacity disparity so large that individual German technical achievements, however genuinely impressive, could not fundamentally alter a war whose material foundations had shifted so decisively against Germany from the moment American industrial capacity became fully, legally, and urgently directed toward defeating the Reich specifically. This decision fits into a broader, and by now familiar pattern this channel has traced across several of Hitler's most consequential wartime choices. A supreme commander whose confidence in his own strategic judgment, hardened by early military successes that owed considerably more to his generals' professional execution than to any personal strategic genius on Hitler's own part, increasingly led him to override or simply ignore expert assessment that ran contrary to his own ideologically shaped intuitions. The pattern that led Hitler to dismiss Guderian's tactical warnings about the winter crisis outside Moscow, to override his own general staff's rejection of Manstein's Ardennes strategy only after that strategy happened to align with instincts Hitler had already independently formed, and to repeatedly discount his professional military advisors' assessments throughout the war's later years, finds its clearest expression in foreign policy in this single voluntary declaration of war against a nation whose industrial potential German diplomatic and economic reporting had, in fact, described with reasonable accuracy information that Hitler's own ideological convictions about American racial and cultural weakness led him to discount in favor of a confident, personally held assessment that events would soon prove catastrophically mistaken. What distinguishes this particular decision from many of Hitler's other consequential wartime choices is the near total absence of any genuine strategic necessity driving it. Unlike the invasion of the Soviet Union, which reflected, however flawed, a calculated wager about defeating an ideological rival before it could fully mobilize, or the various battlefield decisions this channel has examined where Hitler at least faced a genuine choice between competing military options with real trade-offs on both sides. The declaration of war against the United States offered Germany no comparable strategic upside sufficient to justify the risk involved. Germany gained no material or strategic advantage from the declaration that it did not already possess through its existing alliance with Japan and its ongoing, if undeclared, naval confrontation with American forces in the Atlantic. What Germany gained, in the most immediate and practical sense, was the formal, legal, and political authorization for the entire American war economy to be directed against German targets specifically, a gift Hitler delivered to his enemies entirely voluntarily, driven by ideological conviction and personal grievance, rather than any coherent strategic calculation his own military and diplomatic advisors would have endorsed had their private reservations been given genuine weight in the decision-making process. Winston Churchill's own reaction to these December 1941 events, recorded in his post-war memoirs, offers perhaps the clearest contemporary illustration from the Allied side of just how decisively this sequence of events, culminating in Hitler's voluntary declaration, was understood to have transformed the war's ultimate trajectory. Churchill described learning of Pearl Harbor and the resulting American entry into the war with what he characterized as profound relief, and remarkably for a wartime leader receiving news of a devastating attack on an Allies' forces, something approaching genuine satisfaction, writing that he went to bed that night and, in his own words, slept the sleep of the saved and thankful, having concluded, based on his own extensive knowledge of American industrial potential accumulated through years of wartime cooperation and personal correspondence with Roosevelt, that the war's ultimate outcome was now, in his assessment, no longer in serious doubt regardless of whatever difficult fighting remained ahead. This reaction becomes considerably more significant when you recognize that Churchill's confidence was recorded before Hitler's own declaration of war against the United States had even been delivered, based purely on Japan's attack and America's resulting entry into the Pacific War. Hitler's voluntary decision 4 days later, rather than complicating or endangering this Allied confidence, instead removed the last remaining uncertainty about whether the full weight of American industrial mobilization would be directed against Germany specifically, or whether Roosevelt might instead face a prolonged and genuinely uncertain domestic political struggle to build support for a European war effort running parallel to the Pacific conflict Japan's attack had already guaranteed. Churchill's memoirs make clear that Allied leadership understood, considerably more clearly and immediately than German leadership appears to have grasped at the time, just how fundamentally the balance of the war had shifted with American entry, an understanding that renders Hitler's own celebratory framing of his December 11th declaration, delivered to a Reichstag audience, as a confident assertion of German strength and resolve, almost tragically disconnected from how the same event was simultaneously being processed within the highest levels of Allied leadership as confirmation that the war's ultimate outcome had, for all practical purposes, just been decided. Hitler's own private explanations for the decision, recorded by aides and associates who documented his informal conversations throughout this period, reveal a final psychological dimension worth examining before drawing this account to its conclusion. Hitler appears to have placed considerable personal value on being the party who initiated the declaration, rather than waiting for the United States to eventually declare war on Germany once Roosevelt had built sufficient domestic political support to do so. This preference for symbolic initiative over strategic caution reflects a pattern of personal psychology this channel has traced through Hitler's decision-making in other contexts. A consistent preference for actions that reinforced his own self-image as a decisive, historically consequential figure shaping events through bold personal will, over the more cautious, incrementally reasoned approach that his diplomatic and military advisors' actual expertise would have counseled. Hitler reportedly viewed the prospect of eventually being formally drawn into war with the United States through Roosevelt's own initiative, after months of what Hitler perceived as American provocation through Lend-Lease and Atlantic naval confrontation, as a more humiliating outcome than voluntarily declaring war himself. a framing that prioritized Hitler's own sense of personal and national honor over any careful calculation of which sequence of events better served Germany's actual strategic interests. This preference for symbolic initiative over strategic patience, while perhaps psychologically comprehensible given Hitler's well-documented sensitivity to any perceived slight or provocation, produced a decision that handed his enemies, entirely voluntarily and with no accompanying strategic benefit, the single-resourced German naval and economic planners had spent years trying to keep out of the war entirely. The full, unrestrained industrial and military capacity of the United States, formally and legally committed to Germany's defeat from the earliest possible moment rather than delayed by whatever domestic political process might otherwise have been required to bring it fully to bear. It is worth noting, as a final layer of context, that even Japan itself had not specifically requested or necessarily expected Germany's declaration. Having attacked Pearl Harbor as part of its own separate strategic calculation focused primarily on securing resource-rich territories in Southeast Asia and neutralizing American naval power in the Pacific sufficiently to achieve that objective, without any specific coordinated plan requiring German entry into a formal war against the United States as a complementary element of Japanese strategy. Japanese diplomatic correspondence from this period reveals a degree of surprised gratification at Hitler's declaration, since it meaningfully improved Japan's own strategic position by ensuring the United States would need to divide its military attention and industrial output between two major theaters rather than concentrating its full response against Japan alone. But this Japanese reaction also underscores just how genuinely voluntary and strategically unnecessary Hitler's decision actually was from Germany's own narrow national interest, since even Germany's own treaty partner had not required or specifically counted on this particular form of Axis solidarity when planning and executing its own attack on Pearl Harbor. This dynamic between the two Axis partners illustrates a broader asymmetry in how Germany and Japan approached their nominal alliance throughout the war. Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor reflected a carefully calculated, if ultimately strategically flawed, Japanese assessment of what a surprise strike against American naval power in the Pacific might accomplish for Japan's own specific territorial and resource objectives in Southeast Asia. Hitler's response, by contrast, reflected no comparable calculation of what a declaration of war against the United States might accomplish for Germany's own specific strategic objectives in Europe and the Soviet Union. Objectives that a formerly hostile United States, now legally and politically authorized to direct unlimited industrial capacity toward the European theater, would make considerably more difficult to achieve than they had already proven to be against Britain and the Soviet Union alone. The alliance between Germany and Japan, formalized through the Tripartite Pact and reinforced through this voluntary German declaration, ultimately provided each nation with a treaty partner fighting an entirely separate war against an entirely different set of adversaries in an entirely different theater, an arrangement that offered minimal practical military coordination or mutual strategic benefit throughout the remainder of the conflict, but which had, through Hitler's own December 11th decision, successfully guaranteed that both Axis powers would now face the full, formally activated weight of American industrial and military capacity simultaneously, each fighting its own increasingly hopeless war against an opponent whose resources neither nation could plausibly match once fully and legally mobilized against them. Return for a final moment to that 90-minute Reichstag speech on December 11, 1941, and to the specific choice it represented. Not a decision forced upon Hitler by treaty obligation, not a response to direct American attack on German forces or territory, not even a decision his own senior diplomatic and military advisors. However constrained by the institutional culture of deference, this channel has documented throughout Hitler's wartime command, genuinely believed served Germany's strategic interests. It was, in the fullest sense, a voluntary choice, made by a single individual whose ideological convictions about American weakness and whose personal psychological preference for symbolic initiative over strategic caution together produced one of the most consequential unforced errors of the entire war. The consequences of that choice unfolded, as this account has traced, across multiple interlocking dimensions. It solved Franklin Roosevelt's most difficult remaining domestic political obstacle to fighting the war he had already privately concluded was strategically necessary, formally and legally activated the full capacity of the world's largest industrial economy against German targets specifically, accelerated an American entry into the European theater that might otherwise have been delayed by months or longer, as Roosevelt navigated genuine domestic political resistance and confirmed, in Winston Churchill's own private assessment recorded before Hitler's declaration had even been delivered, that the war's ultimate outcome had effectively been decided. None of this required a single German soldier to fire a shot, a single German diplomat to negotiate a concession, or a single German military planner to develop a strategy for defeating American forces specifically. It required only Hitler's own voice before an assembled Reichstag, choosing to formalize a conflict that his own naval commanders had spent years trying to avoid, driven not by strategic necessity, but by a combination of ideological contempt for American capability and a deeply personal preference for being remembered as the party who acted rather than the party who waited to be acted upon. This is, in the end, a story about the specific and consequential danger of a single individual's unchecked judgment shaping decisions of world historical consequence, a pattern this channel has traced across Hitler's dismissal of Guderian, his eventual embrace of Manstein's Ardennes strategy only after it happened to validate his own pre-existing instincts, and now, in this account, his voluntary declaration of war against the one nation whose industrial capacity German strategic planning had spent years working carefully to keep out of the conflict entirely. Every other major decision this channel has examined involved, at minimum, some genuine strategic calculation, however flawed in retrospect, weighing real costs against real potential benefits. The declaration of war against the United States offered no comparable calculation at all, only the confident, ideologically grounded conviction of a single man who believed his own judgment about American weakness superior to the accumulated diplomatic and economic reporting available to him, a conviction that would prove, within less than 4 years, to be perhaps the single most catastrophically mistaken assessment Hitler made across the entire war, delivered not under the pressure of battlefield crisis or strategic necessity, but voluntarily, confidently, and entirely of his own choosing, before a Reichstag audience that had no way of knowing they were witnessing the exact moment Germany's path to defeat became, for all practical purposes, irreversible.